All right, tonight we're going to open up with section 1, which talks about lifespan perspective. And I like to start with Shakespeare, 17th century playwright. And Shakespeare goes on to say that all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. If we think about human development, we start to realize that many of us can identify with what Shakespeare was trying to communicate. Over the course of our life, starting in infancy, of course you wouldn't remember that because of infantile amnesia, which occurs prior to age 3, we realize that when we start becoming conscious and self-aware of our surroundings, and partially because our hippocampus is starting to mature, we also realize that our roles begin to change. Many of us in here see ourselves in a variety of different ways. We might be a daughter or a son, maybe even married and have a spouse, maybe a boyfriend or a girlfriend. As our roles mature and as our lifespan continues to move on in a trajectory forward, we realize that our lives become far more complex, and we start to adjust and we start to make some additional adaptations. Now, depending on where you are right now in your current life, whether it is late adolescence or even early adulthood, we realize that there's going to be certain segments in this book that are going to really resonate with you in a positive and also a negative way. And I say that because many of the choices that we tend to make are a reflection of things that we choose to consciously do, like do drugs, for example, or drink an excessive amount of alcohol, and we realize that our brain and our physiology is affected by such things. Most importantly, who takes this course, and why do people take this course? Everybody has their own personal reason, and it varies. You might find yourself wanting to be a parent because you're in a serious committed relationship, and you're curious to know what you should expect as your baby, or what I like to say is a neonate, grows into infancy in the first 2 years of life. Maybe you want to know what it's like to observe a toddler, or maybe you have an interest in being a teacher and you want to teach little people. And as a result of that, you start to think about the cognitive development and the physiological changes that they can experience. And these are all very rational and reasonable things to expect. And for some of you that might be in mid or even late adolescence, and I say that because some people in here might be 16, others might be 18, you realize as you start pushing the latter part of adolescence and emerging into adulthood, which ends typically at 21, and there are people that are pushing that boundary to 25 at this point, we realize that there are certain things in your life where you feel frustrated. There are stresses that occur, and as a result, you start to take a very close look at your life and you examine it with great detail. And as such, you also start to make subtle changes to the landscape of your life because you realize that if you don't, these inner tensions that you feel percolating under the surface of your skin are only going to continue to amplify, and eventually you will have no choice but to start to pay attention to it. Part of the thing that we realize is you can feel this scratching at our interior, and as a result of that scratching of our interior, we realize eventually that I think it's time for us to start paying attention to such things. But we also realize that going beyond your current milestone, obviously we're not early childhood, but we realize that we have infancy, then we have toddler, then we have early adolescence, mid-adolescence, the latter part of adolescence bringing us into emerging adulthood, and then we realize that there's an early and late part of adulthood, and in those seasons we can expect certain things like a stable job and also potentially a stable relationship. And just to bring Erikson into the narrative, we realize through the psychosocial components of his theory, which has 8 stages, there's one part of the theory which is identity and identity confusion. And if we identify properly and we don't have confusion, which is the antithesis or the crisis that unfolds when we don't develop a firm identity, we also realize that we're now in a position to be open to the prospect of love. And as a result of that, our relationships tend to be a little bit better. They tend to be a little bit healthier. And then you start to think, okay, at what point can I look at my parents? And for some of you, your parents might be in their 40s, maybe even 50s, and that will be referred to as middle age. And then you start to think about their cognitive abilities, you start to think about why they do certain things, and maybe to some degree they're selfish, or maybe to some degree they're less selfish, and why is that? And what are they really trying to accomplish? And then you look at your grandparents, if you still have grandparents and are fortunate enough to experience that, you start to realize, okay, they're in their elderly stage, and that is basically when they hit 60 and onward. And what are the different processes that they go through, cognitively speaking, and also physically speaking? And these are important things because eventually, if you are fortunate enough to grow old and watch your hair grow gray, you will observe your vision weakening because your biology naturally weakens over a period of time. You also recognize that your hearing is starting to fail, or it's not as good as it once was. There would be a number of different reasons for that, loud music, for example, or just the passage of time. And then you also realize that when you're in middle age, and now that you're an elderly at that point, you realize what the book says is that by middle age, you start to realize that this is the season of your life, which is a major milestone, that you start observing major losses. People getting sick, people passing away for various reasons, unintentional or intentional injury. And then when you're in your elderly stage, you realize that other people are passing away and your circle of social influence is starting to shrink. Just think about how many people are surrounding a person that is considered to be a centurion that's 100 years of age. How many true social connections do they really have? Are their social connections at that age different than the way it was when they were 18? And anybody that's already out of high school, for example, and as you go through life, you start to realize that your social circle is beginning to shrink, partially because people are moving to different zip codes and geography, and partially because you have become absorbed with life, meaning that you're in a committed relationship, maybe you have a child, more importantly, maybe your job is very demanding and you're working an ungodly amount of hours, pushing 60, 70 hours a week for the most part, and you realize it's changing the way you can interact with people. These are all really good reasons why you would want to take human development. But why does human development start to become important? Why now? And I think the reason, at least the reason that I started to think, in addition to the reasons that I just mentioned, is mainly because average life expectancy has changed. As a result of average life expectancy changing, and also because of innovative technology that allows us to understand when life actually begins, has allowed us the opportunity to rethink this subject. And the reason I say that is because when we think about the pattern of change that begins, we realize it's different from the traditional perspective. The traditional perspective said, look guys, life begins at birth. And then we have an enormous amount of growth in infancy, adolescence, and then in adulthood it starts to slow down. Then you hit old age, which is like 47, and then from there your decline begins and people are passing away. We now know that the modern perspective or pattern of change to define this subject begins at conception. And conception is going to be defined when you have a sperm and an egg, which we'll call an ovum, that fuse together, and it starts the process of life. And you guys will recognize that as conception. And as one single cell, and through a variety of different processes, mitosis, for example, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, we realize that this process of life is underway. And in a short 2-week period, we realize during the germinal period that we move from one cell to as many as 128 approximately. I don't think they really have a firm answer on how many there really are. But you start to realize, because we have sonograms, because we have functional MRIs, you start to reevaluate when does life actually begin. So for all intended purposes, the definition that is most important is traditional, of course, and that means at birth. But the modern version of when life begins is going to begin at conception. And although we have a lot of change that occurs prenatally in those 38 to 40 weeks, we also realize that there's a tremendous amount of growth people that occur in infancy in the first 2 years of life. And we see that even with toddlers, the way they begin to speak and the way they start to crawl, and then they hop up and they start to try to walk. They fall 1,000,000 times, it appears, and then they finally are able to stand up on their own 2 feet and move around like little people. And then we realize that there's even a lot of growth in adolescence, and we start to observe cognitive abilities that start to show that they're starting to think more abstractly. They're starting to process information quicker, and they're starting to absorb information in a quicker way, and they start to communicate differently as well. And these are really phenomenal and encouraging things to observe. And if anybody's ever observed a kid's sister or a brother, or even a nephew or a niece, or even little people in kindergarten or first grade, it's amazing what you can see as an instructor or a parent or just a caring individual when you actually observe their growth, not only physically, which is usually the most obvious, but also cognitively. And those cognitive abilities should not be understated. And we now know that the starting point is prenatal, and even when you are middle age, 40 to 60, there is still a tremendous amount of growth. Maybe not as much, of course, as adolescence and infancy, for example, but it's still present and it's still there. And that's why, as psychologists, we say that the brain is very plastic, meaning capacity for change. And I want to just clearly emphasize this too, because the late behaviorist, B.F. Skinner, he said prior to his passing, he said with regard to plasticity, if you feel you are too old to change, have the courage to make changes to your environment, which is contextual, and watch the changes unfold. And that is a very important premise in the field of psychology, because as that old saying goes, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, according to Skinner, and I do prescribe to that philosophy and ideology, that we just have to be brave enough to be able to change our environment, and we can watch these changes unfold. And if you feel like your brain is not producing the right type of intellect, or you feel like your intellect is lacking in any way, have the courage to pick up a book and assign yourself some additional collateral reading. Go to Audible. You can get a lot of education through there as well, and be an observant listener, as well as a good read if you decide to also read the written word, because we've got various parts of the brain that need to be engaged for both comprehension and motor development, which we'll talk about at a later date. So the modern view is we're going to start at conception, prenatally, and we're going to observe all these various changes. And even in the elderly status, where 60 and over, or 65 and older, we realize that they still have some amount of plasticity, and they're still able to adapt if we give them the right skills and strategies to make sure that they can still enhance or sharpen their mind, or at least try to maintain what they have. One of the things that I want to mention right here is growth, maintenance, and regulation of loss. These are important. This is an important premise when we think about human lifespan, because each of these dimensions on their own explains human development. But for the most part, it's an incomplete story. And it's an incomplete story because we have to look at it through a different lens. And when we start to bring the biological, the cognitive, and the social cultural values, which I'll demonstrate shortly, we start to realize that we understand people a little bit more. And it starts to make sense. Like, for example, somebody's background and why they might be a particular way. And these three dimensions can help explain that. But let's just think about the trajectory from early on to elderly. And let's just use Tiger Woods as a classic example. Give me a clap if you recognize Tiger Woods as being one of the greatest golfers of all time. I agree with that premise, and I certainly agree that he still is an amazing golfer, but I'm not so sure he's still the greatest. And that's because he has suffered some significant losses in recent years, most importantly the one from last year where he rolled down the side of a cliff in I think it might have been Los Angeles or somewhere in Southern California. I don't remember exactly. But the point is, that's a difficult thing to rebound from. And if you can understand this, at some point in his career, in adolescence, because he was playing since he's like 5 years of age, in adolescence, he was just experiencing a tremendous amount of growth, which continued when he was a young adult as well. And then eventually, you plateau, and then you're trying to maintain what you have. I suspect that eventually Tiger Woods is going to say, I don't need to be the best golfer anymore. I just want to maintain the skill that I have. And then when he hits a certain age, like elderly, he's just going to be happy that he can still walk 18 holes. Or more importantly, he says to himself, I can't walk 18 holes anymore. It's too exhausting for me, given my age and my injuries that have caused me much hardship over recent years and even decades. And then he says, I'm going to use the golf cart. I'm going to walk. I'm going to get back in the cart. I'm going to walk. But I can still do it. And there's still that social component. And at the end of the day, he says, it was a good day. And I think that makes sense. Because as I watch elderly people, I realize that they don't need to be the best at everything anymore. And at a certain age, and give me a clap if you feel at your current age, you find yourself to be highly competitive. And there's going to be a point in time where you might actually say to yourself, maybe that's not so important anymore. I'm okay the way I am. Because you realize your biology is weakening. And you realize certain things are observable. And these challenges are causing you to appear weak in certain areas. And you just have a different perspective, right? And that's normal. But we look at these three constructs, biology, cognitive and social, cultural dimensions, to understand individual differences with people. Because individual differences are important, aren't they? It tells us why somebody appears to be a genius, why somebody appears to be really gifted at a particular sport, or maybe why somebody's just a really searing and provocative and philosophical mind that has everybody just sitting on edge when that person talks in particular. And you say, wow, this is just interesting. What accounts for that anomaly? Why? And you start diving deep into their background. Throughout all of human history, and this goes back into the fundamental question from earlier, why is it that we study human lifespan now the way we do? Well, from all recorded history, the upper boundary of our age can reach up to 122 years of age. And I noted here that the Galapagos turtle is second to us. But ironically, there is a turtle that was picked up by Charles Darwin while he was traveling through the Galapagos Islands. And he was there because he was cataloging his experiences that would also become part of his book on the origin of species in 1859. And more importantly, he is credited not for evolution per se, which means change, but he's actually credited for providing us with the fundamental understanding of the process that describes natural selection and also survival of the fittest. And that's important. Harriet passed away in 2006 at 175 years of age. Pretty remarkable, I think. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the house mouse. Their average life expectancy, age 3. Now, in order for us to understand why this is important, we have to understand where we were. In prehistoric times, our average life expectancy is age 18. By the time we reached ancient Greece, we were age 20. By the time the Industrial Revolution is underway, 19th century England, we're at 41. It took us 5,000 years to increase the human lifespan by 23 years. Think about that. Now, that might not sound all that important if it wasn't for the fact that we have increased our lifespan from 47 in 1900 to 79 in 2017, 32 years in a short period of time. We've done more since the year 1900 than of all recorded history. Now, of course, I had a student that said to me, well, that seems to be a bunch of malarkey because Ancient Greece was 20, but look at Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is what he said yesterday. He said they lived to old age. Fair enough, they did, didn't they? But did everybody live to old age? Think about childbearing. Most women, or a lot of women, would die at birth. Most infants would not make it past 2. If you made it past 5, you were fortunate and you were expected to live longer. Let's not forget about war. War was something that was very common in antiquity. In fact, prior to World War I and World War II, war was a constant theme in Europe. Wasn't that right? And as a result of constant battling and warring with neighboring regions, you realize that it naturally right-sizes the population. So average age of 20 is not far-fetched at that point. It actually makes a lot of sense. So what accounts for some of these anomalies? Well, let's just think about what the book says. The book says sanitation, better nutrition, and medical technology has contributed to our longevity to live to 79. And that's important to understand because just think about this. Sanitation is important because if we have unclean water, we can get dysentery. Our intestines can inflame. We can get diarrhea, and in worst cases, our diarrhea could be so violent that eventually we could die because of it. You know, we opened tonight's lecture with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, when he was celebrating one of his accomplishments, he ventured out of the pub that he was having a pint of beer with some of his friends, and he was thirsty. So he got some water at the neighboring well right there in town, and unknown to himself, he was drinking contaminated water. And he passed away, my guess is from dysentery, not too long after that. It happens. And whenever we have a water scare, we get concerned, like the one that we had in Fort Pierce last year, if anybody remembers that. They wouldn't let us drink from the water fountains in the schools for several days until they figured out what was going on, but there was a parasite and a bacteria. We know that these things can hurt. But we also realize that sanitation is about personal hygiene too. And personal hygiene has increased our lifespan significantly. Just think about this. When you think about the medieval period, it was very common for them not to bathe for an entire year. In fact, when people got married, for example, it was usually in spring weddings. And that's because that's when they would bathe to clean themselves up. One of the things that we have to recognize with personal hygiene is that washing our hands a couple times a day, especially after we go to the restroom, and also bathing once if not twice a day is really important. And let's not forget brushing our teeth, because when we choose not to do those things, bacteria and germs start to collect on our body. And unless we're able to remove it from our external skin, we eventually start to develop illnesses, and in worst case scenarios, diseases. So the mere fact that personal hygiene has improved significantly means that our lifespan has naturally gone up, and it's improved the trajectory of how long we could expect to live. So people with me today, we have an opportunity to live until age 79. And if personal hygiene, just a thought, if personal hygiene is added significantly to our overall lifespan, imagine where we could be if we start to pay attention to our mental health. Give me a clap if sometimes you're concerned about your own mental health because of stress and stressors. Yeah. And give me another clap if sometimes and on occasion you find yourself saying, is it just me or is it other people too? And as you can hear from what people are doing in this room, we realize that we're really not alone. We all have mental health concerns. And before mental health becomes an illness for us, we have to understand how to identify potential causes for those illnesses to occur. And as a result of that, if we can increase our awareness when it comes to mental health, could we potentially reduce the incident rate associated with some health problems that relate to our mental state of mind? Give me a clap if you think that that's reasonable. And that's partially of what this course is covering, because it's not just the good stuff, it's also the bad stuff. And I may not have an opportunity to go over all of it because our time here is limited. But what I do go over tends to be pretty important for our examination, right? Give me a clap if you recognize that now. Good. So a couple other areas that we can also recognize is medicine. How many of us recognize that our parents or our grandparents are still around today thanks to modern medicine? Give me a clap. Now, this is important because we have to remember, if our goal is to live a long life, our goal also should be, I think, to live a long life where we're not taking medicine for as long as we can. We're still strong enough to rely on ourselves, and we don't have to rely on other people. And we also don't need to use a walker or a cane or anything else like a wheelchair. And that's ultimately what we hope for. Give me a clap if you share that sentiment as well. And if all goes well, if we can make it to 122, would you like those terms? I think so, and I'll put myself in that bucket as well, and these are important things. Now, the reason I want to mention this too is right now we have more people over the age of 60 than we do under the age of 18. Think about that. So if you want to go into careers for nursing, medical doctor, a psychologist on the clinical route, and also maybe psychiatry and hold a medical doctor license along with some additional training so you could be a psychiatrist as well. These are good fields for you because there's going to be a huge demand. By the time we hit the year 2050, we will have approximately 2.1 billion people over the age of 60. That number is expected to swell, and we will have a large population over the age of 85. Most importantly, they say in the upcoming generations, we're going to have the largest centurion population in the world. What does that mean? People that are at 100 or older. Right now, when you hear that somebody has made it to 100 years of age, you might be like me. Wow, that's pretty impressive. There's going to come in time where you're just going to say, perhaps, if the data is right, yeah, same thing with my grandmother. Yeah, same thing with my uncle. Yeah, it's not going to seem so unusual. Just like right now, there's an expectation, if all goes well and we don't have an unfortunate, unforeseen accident, that we have an expectation that we should live until age 79. And that's going to continue to move up. Now, of course, we don't know what these numbers are going to look like because of COVID when the next series of data comes out. And we don't know how severe or significant monkeypox is going to be at this point, and how those two illnesses or diseases are going to affect the average life expectancy. If all goes well, they won't affect it too much. If they do, maybe it'll set us back a little. We don't know yet until the data is actually published. And there's an important person that I want you to remember. Her name is Laura Cartesen. And Laura is important because she says in the bullet point, science, technology, and social expectations have not caught up with an aging population. And the reason that she says this is because when you think about our environments that we occupy, they're really set up for people that are young, agile, and they can move around relatively quickly. If you look at this room, for example, it's not very user-friendly for people that come in with a wheelchair, is it? You can imagine if they do, they would have to sit in the back row on the other side of the door, which is the exit, or we would have to make accommodations in the aisle. In fact, if you go to a theater, you'll find the same thing. Seating is relatively close together. They're not very wide. It makes it difficult for anybody to walk down the aisle. And if you are handicapped, you realize that that's even more problematic. Laura says that we need to start thinking about these things because if the data is correct, we are going to start having a significant amount of people that are over 60, over 85, and when they start reaching centurion level, they're still going to want culture and stuff like that. I was reminded of that when I went to the ballet last year at the Kravitz Center in West Palm Beach. And when I went to the Kravitz Center, I was surprised that me and Maritza were some of the youngest people in that audience. Most of the people there were 60, 70, 80, and I think they were pushing 100. I saw people in scooters, wheelchairs, walkers, and even using a cane. And when I wanted to get my seat, I had to tightly fit in between people as I made my way to the center of the seating, which was center stage. And I said, wow, this is interesting. People weren't getting up, and they weren't getting up because they weren't rude. It's because their mobility was restricted. And that's interesting. And I said to Maritza, I said, you know, it's interesting what I just read about Laura Carterson. And she said that our environments are really not set up to handle the demand of what people that are older experience, especially when they become frail and they can't move around as much. Why are the aisles not wider? Why is the seats not wider? Why are the aisles for the seating not wider? It's kind of a tight fit. And if anybody's ever experienced that, not a problem for you. But imagine if you had another 40, 50 years of mileage on your life. What would that feel like, right? And that's an important thing to understand. She also says something about the elderly. And as part of the elderly, she says that the young people have a tendency, from her perspective in her research, and it's all research-based, so this is what she's sharing, that they don't really appreciate the value that the older generation offer. In other words, their time has come, it's time to move on, right? Almost like that. And what she's saying here is that we have to be mindful as a young generation that even the elderly that are frail and they can't move around that much, and yes, they might have some health concerns, they still offer a great deal of expertise, regardless of their lot in life and regardless of their education level. Because there comes a point, too, where you realize that experience is invaluable, and they have a lot of experience at that point. They also tend to be more emotionally balanced, and in fact, part of this chapter 1 says that as you get older, despite the medical conditions that you might have, you tend to feel happier. That's interesting. And you don't feel such a need to be an accomplished person anymore. Whereas with your age, give me a clap if you recognize young people usually tend to be self-absorbed. Also, they tend to be self-interested. Behavior is both universal and predictable, isn't it? And I'm sure these older people that come with deep expertise and emotional balance and also wisdom felt exactly the same way that we did at their age. You know, we hit different milestones, right? And as we hit these different milestones, we come with different perspectives as a result of it. So lifespan perspective is talking about a few different things right here that I just want to run through. We see that lifelong, meaning that there's a beginning and an end. There's an alpha, there's an omega. For us, it's going to be prenatal. The end point is going to be death. We realize that there's different dimensions to life, and we see abstract reasoning, speed of processing, even attention and memory changes depending on the season in which we are living. Adolescence, you're absorbing a lot, right? You're elderly, you realize that the speed of processing and the ability to be more abstract and engage your fluid intelligence starts to wane, and you're not able to do it the same way, even though your crystallized intelligence, which is your vocabulary or your library of vocabulary over a lifetime, tends to be rather stable. And I think that there's reasons for that, and I think one of the reasons why fluid intelligence, which is your raw mental ability, starts to wane is primarily because, I shouldn't say primarily, but I feel it's primarily, so maybe I'll just keep with that thought, is we know that as we get older, our cardiovascular system weakens. And I think it's no accident that our fluid intelligence, according to data, starts to soften when we're in our late 20s. And if the data is right, I think one of the reasons is because many people will work multiple jobs. Many people will also be confined to a cubicle or a chair, which is very unnatural for us, by the way. We were meant to be up and about and be in the fields, and now we confine ourselves to a desk. And in a lot of ways, just to say in the spirit of Rousseau, everywhere man is free and yet he is in chains. We are chained to a cubicle. We are chained to a desk. In fact, I've got it a little bit easier right now because as I stand up here, I'm thinking and I'm walking and so forth like that, and I'm looking at a sea of people. Many of you, and give me a clap if this pertains to you, although you're listening to me, you are going in and out of consciousness or awareness, for example, and I could see you're one of them, Rachel. Those micro expressions are giving it away. But you're going in and out of awareness, and you're having a private conversation in your mind as I'm talking, and then you bring yourself back to the front, and you're listening, and it keeps on toggling back and forth, right? Awareness, out of awareness. I could see you're one of them as well, right? So give me a clap if you've done that since the beginning of this lecture. Human behavior is both predictable and it's also universal, isn't it? Notice I don't get upset about it because I do it too. I just don't do it right now because I'm talking, so I'm at a different level of engagement, so we recognize that. Now the other thing is, there's different directions, and an example I'd like you to remember, parents have a child, and at age 4, their child is now speaking fluent English. By the time the child is age 6, they're speaking fluent Spanish. And by the time they're age 8, they are having a hard time mastering French. And the reason that the book gives is because you get to a point where it becomes more difficult to absorb additional knowledge and to learn another language. But I also think there might be another reason for that anomaly as well. And the other reason that I was thinking about, at age 8, for example, your world is changing, isn't it? You're in school. You're being introduced to a variety of different subjects. You're getting knowledge from sciences, math, English. You're starting to write. You could imagine that this particular student at this point is having a hard time mastering another language because they're also required to learn everything else. And that makes it rather taxing on their mental resources. In fact, it taxes their mental resources, and they have a hard time doing that. Personally, I've been trying to learn German and French and Spanish for the last 5 years. I've got Rosetta Stone. I always run out of the gate strong, and then I fade. And the reason I fade is because I read over 200 pages a month. I listen to Audible constantly. I'm constantly lecturing, and I find myself just exhausted. And it makes it rather difficult to learn a new language. And I'm confident I can master all 3. I just don't have the time to do it. So I think a lot of times when we're trying to learn something that's rather foreign, and if we're not in another culture where we have that experiential approach to learning, we're engaging our 5 senses, and we are absorbing things based on the way we're interacting with people in context, it makes it rather difficult, right? How many of you realize that even after you mastered Spanish in high school, you realize you can't use it and you forget it as quickly as you did, but you got a good grade because you mastered the vocabulary sheets? Give me a clap if that's you. What would your experience be like if you were engaging your senses differently and you were actually placed in a different culture? I'm always reminded of Catholic priests because at a certain point in their seminary training, they are required to be assigned to a diocese in South America. And they are required to read, write, and speak Spanish fluently after they get back 12 months later. Isn't that interesting? So when you think about the importance of cultural immersion, you realize that that is necessary and important if we want to retain a language and make sure that it's relevant for what we're trying to do. That's why I often tell people that are first generation here when they're Spanish. I get students sometimes where they're like, no, I don't want to learn Spanish. My parents speak it. I don't know it. I don't want to. And I think that that's really just unfortunate because they should speak it in their household and they should even speak it in their classroom when it's appropriate. And I encourage people to do that at the high school that I teach in. So my dual enrollment students, some of them Latina-based or Latino-based, they speak Spanish to one another, and then when they speak to me, I'm like, poquito, they laugh, and they speak English again, and I encourage it. I don't know what they're saying, but I encourage it. I would suspect they're saying nice things about me. But I think that that's important because they should be exercising that ability constantly in order to retain it so they can use it whenever they need to and they can switch back and forth. And I think that makes sense. We realized that one of the characteristics which I mentioned before was being plastic, and I shared my view of B.F. Skinner. But let me give you another example with a CPA. When I think about a CPA, I think about certain traits. Give me a characteristic in their personality that you think you would expect with somebody that's a really gifted CPA. Do you think they would be like really gregarious and outgoing, or do you think they would be rather boring and dry? Okay, dry. I would think the same thing, and I think that that's the common thought, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's used in the context of plasticity to represent change and capacity to adapt and change. You've got a 57-year-old accountant. He's got a graduate degree in accounting, and he's a certified public accountant. He's good with balance sheets, income statements. He knows what deductions to remove, which ones to avoid. He knows how to make the bottom line seem more attractive to his customers and certainly to the IRS without paying a lot in taxes, and he's very gifted at that. But he realizes that his personality is as dry as a bottle of gin. So what does this accountant do? Even though he's got a graduate degree, he decides to go to his local community college and he enrolls in a creative writing class because he feels like he needs something to give him a little pick-me-up. Throughout the course of the academic term, he discovers that he's got a creative outlet. He's got a creative mind. And as a result of that, he starts writing more. And he realizes he's not as dull as he once was. And maybe, who knows, maybe eventually he publishes a book as well. And that would be a nice outcome, right? And maybe he writes a book where it's centered around a thriller that has to do with tax evasion and stuff like that, shell companies. Certainly a person like that with a creative mind could write a nice psychological thriller about something like that. But that's interesting, and it goes right to the premise of who is more plastic than others and has different degrees of plasticity. But it would be nice to know that you have a creative outlet. Me personally, I wrote and published a book, and I shared that with you last week during orientation. And I discovered that I do have a creative energy, and that's why I'm thinking about writing a psychological thriller now based in a European landscape, because I've seen most of Europe at this point, and I want to base my characters on that. I just haven't had the time to start. That's why I haven't, but I'm still formulating some ideas. But the point is, I believe that I have a creative energy, and that would be another example of plasticity. And you don't really know that until you put yourself in that type of environment and you recognize it. And of course, you know, there's different disciplines that focus on human lifespan. Archaeologists, anthropologists that study the origin of human culture and artifacts. And we realize that even English teachers that teach literature have an interest in this subject too, because they can write about a storyline that has character exploration and so forth. And you realize that medical doctors, psychologists, and so forth, they all have an interest in understanding human development and lifespan, because you realize that all these fields are literally interrelated, and that's an important premise. And of course, when we talk about context, context is important because we realize that words carry action, and depending on the context or where you are in a culture, can actually give us a different meaning. Just like if I said to you, what does it mean to have a gift? You would realize, well, it's probably something I want, and that's something that's clear, and you'd be excited about it because you're thinking about it like an American who speaks English, right? But if you were in Germany, and you used the word gift, it's actually rooted in the medieval Germanic language, and it actually means poison. Interesting, right? So when you're in a different culture, we have to be mindful of settings and context. And let's not forget how we joke around with people. When we joke around with people in certain settings, it's not very concerning. But if we joke around with some people in other settings, it can be highly questionable and rather provocative. Like if you're going to see the movie The Joker, and then all of a sudden somebody stands up and says, I am going to kill everybody. Would you be concerned about that, or would you think it's just a joke? I would be looking for the exit. Would you guys? Give me a clap if you would. And I think that's a sane and rational premise, that we should look for an exit because that person does not seem or appear right, and we can't trust their actions. So then we also realize that Paul Botz, who actually really was the architect of lifespan development, he talks about normative age-graded influences, and he gives an example of what we should expect at a particular age. So in our culture, industrialized country, we expect people to start school at about 6 years of age, right? We also realize that people that are retiring, they will retire somewhere in their 50s and also their 60s. And of course, you have the outliers that will push the envelope until their last breath, and they'll go as far as 90 or even a little bit more if they're physically fit to some reasonable degree and their mind is still well intact. And then we also have puberty. A good age for puberty, could we agree on 12? So somewhere around 12 years of age, and of course at age 12, you realize when you experience puberty, you're becoming reproductively ready to procreate and also pass your genes on to another generation or version of yourself. Genetically speaking, the progeny just continues to move along. But even if you hit puberty at age 12, for example, it usually takes about a year for girls, as an example, before their reproductive system is ready to actually get pregnant. So then you realize that, okay, if we can have children at age 12 or 13, a year after puberty, then how do we look at this? Well, if we look at it from a biological perspective, you would probably say from a Western perspective that having a child at 12 or 13 is inappropriate and it's unacceptable, right? And fair enough. I agree with that premise because we have more access to education and we prioritize and we push or defer gratification of having a family and children further and further into the distance because of education. But a true statistics, in this chapter, I don't remember if it's in the second or third section of chapter 1, but there's a girl from Bangladesh by the name of Dolly, and she works with UNICEF. She's in her 20s now and she's an engineer, but nevertheless, when she was in adolescence, she was working with UNICEF, an arm of the United Nations, and she was going door to door to work on personal hygiene because garbage and sewage was a problem in the city, and it still is in Bangladesh. And she was trying to convince many of the parents not to let their daughters get married in adolescence. And the reason for that is because 2/3 of girls in Bangladesh are married before the age of 18 and already starting to have family. Give me a clap if you think that's strange from a Western perspective. You don't think that's strange? You guys are becoming timid. Now, interestingly, we say that that's strange, but their access to education is far different than it is here. And you could also imagine that people there might look at us pushing 30 or 40, and in some cases, even 50, before we actually decide to get married and have a family. And in our culture, when we think about what's normal for an age-graded influence, let's just use menopause, and that's an important thing that I want you to remember, as well as the other examples I provided you, is what age could a woman on average expect to experience menopause? And that just simply means that her reproductive organs are no longer able to reproduce. And the age there is age 51. So you've got people pushing above that, people experiencing menopause earlier. But for the most part, if you're curious yourself, at what time? The age is 51 right now in our culture. And then, of course, we also have history that is normal for a particular generation. And we look at issues surrounding civil rights movement, the 1930s Great Depression. And what Paul Botts is saying here basically is we've all learned about the Great Depression as an example in a textbook, American World, maybe even watch a documentary. And let's just put a Holocaust on there too for World War II. Can we truly understand the significance of what people went through in those environments if we've never experienced it? And how many of us would have clapped, just say, that was horrible, but thank God I wasn't around then? Yeah, fair enough. I say the same exact thing. And that is that's a normal premise for all of us to experience. And then we have the non-normative life events. These are events that occur, and we know they occur, but they're odd. A good example that's positive is winning lotto. You go, you play $1, and by some strange luck of fate or maybe divine intervention, you walk away with $3 million. How nice would that be? It could really change your life, right? And we hear about it on occasion, and maybe even you know somebody that's experienced that. But for the most part, many of us will not know what that's like. I know I certainly don't. But we also know that people's parents pass away when they're in adolescence. And that happens. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it does happen. It could be from an illness, it could be from a car accident, and when it happens, it's unfortunate, truly unfortunate, but we know stuff like that happens, and it's called non-normative life event. We also realize that teenage pregnancy is very low at this point, and we also realize that when it does happen, it's unusual. That would be non-normative. We also realize a house burning down or an earthquake that destroys the house, or even just take an example where you've got a boy by the name of John that's living in an urban environment like New York City. And living in an urban environment is far different than living in a rural environment. I think we all know that. And when they are forced to move for whatever reasons, now they're living in a rural environment, kind of like Stewart or something like that, their world changes. And so does their worldview. Their perspective on life changes as well. And I think if anybody's ever gone to New York City or a major city, you realize that life is far different there, and the access to various parts of culture, good and bad, by the way. You know, you've got the underbelly of the beast in most places like that. You realize that there's things that enhance your life and things that can detract from your life in environments like that. We also realize in Lifespan that culture plays a big part of the way we develop and how we see things and how we develop cognitively. It also has an effect on our physiology as well, and it can add or take away stress that we experience. So it's the pattern of behaviors and beliefs that we develop early on that make up our culture. And our culture is very diverse, and right now, the largest segment of ethnicity, and ethnicity is rooted in ancient Greek, and it means nation. And the largest population of ethnicities currently that are growing at a very, very fast pace is Asian American and also Latino Americans. Fastest two groups in our culture. And other cultures like African American, they're actually going down. Caucasians are actually starting to soften as well. But those two areas, both Asian American and also Latino American, are actually growing pretty significantly at this point. So you could imagine the reason that they talk about this in the book is because diversity with different peoples and different cultures is kind of an enriching experience. And it's kind of like in a book that I read, it's the spice of life. And that is, I think, a true statement. You know, anybody that travels throughout the world and you indulge in different languages and also customs and also different cuisines, you can start to appreciate that. But let's not forget what the book says. Diversity also comes with a great deal of challenges. And without getting into those challenges right now, maybe at a later date we will when it's appropriate, we realize that that's just part of it. And then we also realize that there's a socioeconomic status too, where people based on occupation, education, and also economic characteristics, low, middle, upper class, they will determine literally how you command resources. Somebody that's making $250,000 a year is commanding far more resources for a more enjoyable social life than somebody that's earning $40,000. Does that make sense? Give me a clap if that makes sense. So we realize that it's a constant struggle between economics, education, and how we acquire and maintain and also hold on to resources so we can continue enjoying a social life. And let's not forget about gender, which is starting to become quite complex, as you're already aware. So gender is male, female, and biologically male and female, as it is on your birth certificate. And then you realize that other types of gender is starting to evolve and surface in mainstream culture. And the word transgender comes up a lot, where people will actually adopt a gender that is different than their biological birth. And we see that happening more and more. Interestingly, in another portion of this book, I think it might be in chapter 1, if not certainly in chapter 2, it says one of the interesting things when it comes to transgender, There are actually more boys that are claiming to be transgender, taking on the identity of an opposite sex from where they were born, than girls. And then you say to yourself, could there be a social cultural perspective or viewpoint that accounts for that? Potentially. But let's just assume that it's more biologically driven, for example. So then you start looking at chromosomes. Well, girls are XX, boys are XY. They share the X chromosome. Could there be a particular chromosome on a gene that can help identify the very nature of what it means to be potentially transgender that can account for more boys claiming that than females? Interesting, right? So then you start to put the scientific mind to work to see if there is a valid claim there or whether or not there is not. Now, one of the interesting things about our culture, too, is regarding socioeconomic status, right? We recognize that there's poor. We realize that there's people middle of the road. And we realize that there's people that they command a lot of resources. And to some degree, maybe a lot of us want to be similar to them, maybe not with all the burdens they shoulder. But nevertheless, we realize that it makes life a little bit easier. And one of the things that we realize when we analyze poor people and middle class, for example, there are 6 indices that they use to determine who has greater exposure to certain indices. So for example, if we look right here and we look at family turmoil, child separation, exposure to violence, crowding, excessive noise, and poor housing quality, we realize by this bar graph that poor people are experiencing more of these stresses than people that are in a middle class family. Now, one of the interesting things about this graph is that exposure to violence, although you're more likely to experience it if you come from a poor background than middle class, but both of them are rather high. And I think one of the reasons for that anomaly could be video games, movies, streaming services, things of that nature. Even if they're not physically experiencing violence, they're experiencing it to some degree. And I think that that makes sense because when we go to a movie, if you're like me, for example, one of the hallmarks of a good movie for me is when there's action and there's a lot of interesting things happening. That's why I tend to like movies like Mission Impossible, James Bond. I also like, the most recent on Amazon Prime called The Terminal List. That's actually really interesting, and it was a series. And then Jack Ryan. And when you think about all those elements that make a really good thriller, suspense movie or drama, it has all the same characteristics. So in fact, even though I'm not directly involved in violence, I'm indirectly involved in violence, right? And as a result of that, my viewing habits when I do watch TV shows usually consist of that because I find it enjoyable. How many other people can relate to that? Yeah, so I'm not alone either, and neither are you. And we also realize that in other countries, poor is less frequent than in our culture. So for example, in children living in poverty in our country, in 1997, it represented 23%. And then we saw it going down in 2001. By the time we got to 2015, this is in the aftermath of the Great Recession, it was back up to 19.7, and then in 2017 at 17.5. What's even more interesting when you look at data like this, and I'm not sure what the data would show now until we get our next text revision, but one of the interesting things is when we look at Canada and Sweden, progressive and also industrialized, they only have 9% in Canada living in poverty and 2% of children living in poverty. Interesting. At least I think that that's pretty interesting to note. And if we look at the data in 2015, we realize that there's been an improvement with both African Americans and Latino, but the numbers are still concerning if the data is somewhat relative today than 2015. In 2015, it's down to 26% for Latino and 33% for African American. So we realize that these are still consistent issues. And when somebody is living in poverty and with those 6 indices, you also realize that there's a physiological response, right? So you're more likely to have hypertension. You're more likely to be obese, for example. you're more likely to be or feel stressed out all the time, because poor people also tend to share rooms with other people, whereas middle class background children tend to be in their own room. And that's one of the things that I want to stress, because it is stressful to live in the same room with anybody. And when somebody does, they realize that it's not just them in that space, and they have to be mindful about things that they do in that space, because it stresses out the other person, just like their activity stresses you out if you ever experience that. And we realize that social policies usually tend to gear towards children, but it's not just children that we need to focus on. We need to focus on all aspects of our culture, including adults, including and significantly our elderly as well. Because I think the book says, I'm trying to remember the specific statistic, where the elderly get medical attention only something like 53% of the time. Not important for your exam, but just want to let you know that it's concerning. And then if they have Alzheimer's, for example, or more serious conditions, it's even worse than that. And the reason that that's important to note, people, is because the current trend right now is that people are choosing not to get married, they're choosing not to have children, and they're also choosing to live by themselves. So when you start pushing elderly and you start pushing towards Centurion, and your body is breaking down because you've got more mileage on your life, because your biology is naturally weakening, you realize that traditionally the person that would take care of you and take you to the doctor would be a spouse or even your child. And if you're not getting married and you're living by yourself and you don't have a child to look after you, who's going to make sure that you're taking your medicine if you're experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's, for example? And who's to say that you're eating the right way too? So you could see how much of a mess this is if we don't start to shape social policy to make sure that we take care of that segment of the population, because it's not just going to be a few people. It is going to be a large amount of people. Then that, again, is why nursing and doctors and psychologists that are clinical are going to be important in the upcoming generation. Now, they do say that people that tend to be more resilient come from a specific background, even though that they're poor. And when I say specific background, if you look at individuals, they tend to have a lot of faith, they have higher self-esteem, higher confidence. They also tend to have better intellectual functioning. They seem to be more appealing and sociable to people their own age, and adults tend to like them too. And I say that because, you know, as you get older, you realize not all adults like children, right? Especially when they act up and they're like, oh God, here we go again, right? And just being fair, we realize that that happens too. And then when we look at resiliency with family, do they have a close relationship with their parent figure? Is their parent figure permissive, indulgent? Are they authoritarian? Or do they have a warm, structured, nurturing style that is more authoritative? And these are important because even teachers can have an authoritative or an authoritarian voice. They can even be indulgent and permissive, but we realize that. So how does that affect one's cognitive development? How does that affect their worldview? These are all important things. And you know, an important aspect here too is, do they bond with a particular adult that is important to them while they're developing? And that's important too, because sometimes what adolescents will cite later in their adulthood is that there was that one adult at camp, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, church, a teacher, an administrator that had a direct influence on who I am right now. Maybe it was an athletic team, for example. So when we think about some children, despite adversity and what happens to them in perpetual poverty, they tend to be more resilient if they have some aspects with these three dimensions for who they keep in contact with outside the family, family relationships, and also individual. And just because you're poor, people, as an example, it doesn't mean you won't be resilient. I often tell people, you know, if you have love in a household and you're poor, you have a lot more than most people that have no love in a household. You'd be surprised how far that actually goes. Knowing that somebody loves you at the end of the day and they can embrace you and say you're going to be okay. And a lot of times, until a certain particular age, you might not even realize that you're poor because you have an abundance of love. You still have food. Granted, you might not have the right sneakers or the right wardrobe, and you're not living in the right zip code. But until a certain age, are you really aware of it? And sometimes parents that have a lot of love will go to great lengths to make sure that that's not a visible landscape for you until it becomes visible because of self-awareness and certain age where you start to think and you're introduced to other people, for example, and then you're like, wow, I have a little bit rougher, right? Because now you're comparing and contrasting. We could also see by this diagram here that in 1900, the amount of people that were living over the age of 65 represented less than 5% male and female of the population. And we can also see as time goes on, that figure is growing, and by 2040, they're expecting it to increase significantly. And of course, you see that female are expected to outlive men. And my thinking is more women go into the workforce and take more prominent positions, maybe their average life expectancy will be more akin to that of men because of heart disease and stuff like that, because work does stress you if it's not controlled. I do want to talk about a few things that I hope makes sense when we look at this, but we look at, actually let me go forward and this will make sense because we don't have much time left. But I put these three images up here. The image in the middle is a middle-aged man between age 40 and 60. The image to the left is a woman over the age of 70. And the image to the right is a man who is age 100.
Age 100?
Age 100, and he's competing. His name is Don, if I'm not mistaken, Don Pellman. He literally just passed away in 2020. He was 105 when he passed away. But this picture was taken when he was still competing. Quite remarkable, isn't it? And you see the other woman challenging herself and competing. And the book says that they are outperforming people 10, 20, 30 years younger than them. Give me a clap if you feel that that's pretty impressive. The interesting thing here is when we look at the chronological age of the two individuals on the right and left side of this frame and compare the chronological age of this middle-aged person, you realize that although their age is saying one thing, their biological age is saying something different. We would expect that the biological age of their internal organs for Don on the right and this woman on the left is far younger than their actual chronological age. Whereas the biological capacity of the middle-aged person who is far younger than these two people probably is older than their chronological age, their internal organs. And that's an important thing to note because if you're looking at some people, you say, what accounts for that person to look so young? Why is that person so agile at their age? I don't get it. And you can't help but think, what are they drinking? Are they drinking water constantly? 5, 6 bottles of water or 50, 60, or 70 ounces a day? Are they drinking wine for dinner? Are they on a vegan diet? Do they drink shots of tequila before they go to bed? Could that be one of the reasons? Now, I know that that sounds kind of strange to say, but you know, as a scientist, you're thinking, what is it about their daily regimen that could be contributing to this person's strength in old age? And why is it that they're outperforming at age 100? Don is outperforming people that are 20, 30 years younger than him. How do we explain it? So understanding what they drink, what they eat, how many hours they sleep, what kind of medicines are they taking, what is their daily life like, how many miles a day do they walk, are they socially engaged in the community, are they constantly talking and engaging with people and trying to learn? You know, these are very fair questions to ask because at the end of the day, we all want to live to a ripe old age, I think, and I think that that's a fair premise. All right, we're out of time now. We'll continue this conversation for the next chapter next week. Have a great evening, people, and make sure you complete your homework by Sunday. Thank you.